My daughter-in-law cut me off in the middle of my own sentence, at my own table, and told the whole family that once the renovation was done, the kitchen would finally feel like hers. Not ours. Hers. I laughed at first, thinking she meant it the way people say things without meaning them. But Priyanka didn't laugh back. She looked at me the way you look at someone who's already been dealt with, and went back to her plate like the conversation was over, because as far as she was concerned, it was. I had signed papers 2 years ago, after my fall, because my son told me it was the responsible thing to do. Protective paperwork, they called it. Nothing that would ever actually change anything. That night, sitting alone in the house I paid off myself, I finally asked myself the question I'd been avoiding since dessert: what, exactly, had I signed my name to? My name is Eleanor. I'm 68 years old, and I have lived in this house for 31 years. I raised my son Daniel in the room that is now, apparently, going to be a home office once the renovation is done. My husband Frank and I bought this house when Daniel was 4, back when the street was still half built and the backyard was just dirt and a swing set we put together ourselves on a Saturday afternoon. After Frank passed, I was the one who finished paying it off, on my own salary as a school administrator, over 11 more years of careful budgeting. I tell you that not to complain about money. I tell you it because it matters to what happened next, and because for 2 years I let myself forget that it mattered at all. Daniel grew up, married Priyanka 9 years ago, and by most measures they built a good life together. 2 kids, a modest house of their own 15 minutes from mine, and a habit of Sunday dinners at my place that had gone on for years without incident. I liked Priyanka, or believed I did. She was organized in a way I appreciated, the kind of person who remembered everyone's allergies and sent calendar invitations for birthdays 2 months in advance. If she was controlling, I told myself that was just how some people showed love, through logistics instead of hugs. 2 years ago, in February, I fell in my own driveway on a patch of ice I should have salted the night before, and broke my hip badly enough to need surgery. There was a rehabilitation stay of nearly 3 weeks, followed by months of slow, frustrating recovery at home. Daniel and Priyanka were, by every outward measure, wonderful during that stretch. Priyanka brought meals twice a week. She drove me to physical therapy when Daniel couldn't get off work. And about 3 weeks after I came home from rehab, still moving with a walker, still groggy some afternoons from the medication, she sat across from me at my own kitchen table with a manila folder and told me it was time we got some protective paperwork in place, just in case. She already had a lawyer in mind, a woman named Renata Cole, a friend of a friend, Priyanka said. Someone reasonable who wouldn't charge us the way the big downtown firms would. The idea of someone else handling logistics sounded, honestly, like a relief. I was tired in a way I had never been tired before, tired down in my bones, and the folder Priyanka slid across the table looked less like a burden and more like someone finally taking something off my plate. I signed a power of attorney. I signed something described to me as a living trust update. Priyanka told me, more than once, in that calm, organized voice of hers, that it was all temporary, standard. The same as before, just cleaner. I asked her once, half joking, if she was trying to steal my house out from under me, and she laughed and said, "Don't be silly, Eleanor, it's just paperwork." I believed her, because I had no real reason not to. She was my son's wife. She had brought me soup twice a week. For a month. For most of the 2 years that followed, nothing seemed to change. I still paid my own bills. I still lived in my house, alone, cooking my own meals, tending my own garden, exactly as I had before the fall. If anything felt different, it was only in small phrases that crept into conversation. When we redo the kitchen, Priyanka would say, or, our house is drafty in the winter, meaning mine, and I let those slide the way you let a lot of small things slide with family, because pointing them out feels petty, and because I genuinely didn't want to believe there was anything behind them worth pointing out. Then came the Sunday dinner in September. It was a full house that night: Daniel, Priyanka, their 2 kids, my sister Marian, and 2 of Priyanka's friends from her book club who I didn't know well but had met once or twice before. We were somewhere past the main course, into the lull before dessert, when the conversation drifted, as it often did lately, toward the renovation Priyanka had been planning for months. New cabinets. New flooring. A different color on walls I had chosen and painted myself, twice, over 3 decades. I said, gently, that I'd like to be part of those decisions, since it was, after all, my kitchen. Priyanka didn't even look up from her plate. You don't need to worry about that part, Eleanor. Daniel and I handle all of that now. Then, to the table, to her friends, to my own sister, she added, almost brightly, once it's done, it's finally going to feel like my kitchen. Not ours. Hers. The table went quiet in that specific way a room goes quiet when everyone has noticed something and no one wants to be the one to say so. Marian looked at me. Daniel looked at his plate, moving a piece of chicken around with his fork like it required his full concentration. One of Priyanka's friends laughed. Awkwardly, the way people laugh when they're not sure if something was a joke. And I sat there, in my own dining room, in the house I'd paid off myself, feeling like a guest who had overstayed a welcome I didn't remember agreeing to. I didn't argue. I asked if anyone wanted coffee and got up to make it, because that's what you do when you're the only person at the table who seems to think anything unusual just happened. But that night, after everyone left and I'd washed the last of the dessert plates, I sat alone at my kitchen table. My kitchen table, whatever anyone wanted to call it, and let myself actually think, for the first time in 2 years, about the papers I had signed, instead of trusting that I remembered them correctly. I didn't have copies within easy reach that night, just my memory of that afternoon 2 years earlier. And my memory said one word clearly: temporary. 1 year, Priyanka had told me. A safety net, not a change in ownership. If that was true, that net should have expired more than a year before that dinner ever happened. I called Marian the next morning, mostly to hear whether I sounded as unreasonable out loud as I worried I might. I told her about the kitchen comment, about temporary, about the year that had come and gone. Marian didn't laugh it off the way I half expected her to. She said the word, hers, had bothered her too, sitting right there at the table, and that she'd almost said something herself before deciding it wasn't her place. Hearing that someone else had noticed it, unprompted, was what finally convinced me this wasn't me being a difficult old woman looking for a reason to be offended. Something had actually shifted, quietly, over 2 years, and I was the only person in the family who hadn't been told. The first thread came about 3 weeks later, and it came by accident, the way these things usually do. A property tax notice arrived in my mailbox, addressed not to me, but to Priyanka Patel, owner. At my own address. My first instinct was that the county had made a clerical error. These things happen, addresses get crossed, names get attached to the wrong parcel file. My second thought, the one I couldn't quite shake no matter how I tried to reason it away, went straight back to that dinner table, and the word hers. Instead of calling Daniel, which is what I would have done a year earlier, I called the county assessor's office myself. The clerk who answered was patient with an old woman asking too many questions, and after pulling up my parcel number, she told me something that made my stomach drop in a way that had nothing to do with my hip. The property, she said, had listed 2 parties of record for over a year, myself and a trust naming Priyanka and Daniel as beneficiaries. Not a clerical error. Not an odd turn of phrase at dinner. A fact, on file with the county, that I had never been told. That evening I dug through the metal lockbox where I keep my important papers and found my own copy of the power of attorney from 2 years earlier. There it was, in the language, plain as anything, a term of 1 year, renewable only by written consent. I had never given written consent to renew anything. I had never even been asked a second time. I called the county recorder's office the next morning and requested copies of any documents filed against my property in the previous 2 years. The woman on the phone told me it would be faster to come in person, so 2 days later I drove downtown myself, stood in a short line behind a young couple arguing quietly about a boundary dispute, and paid $11 in copying fees for an envelope I was almost afraid to open in the parking lot. I opened it anyway, sitting in my car with the engine off, because I didn't trust myself to wait until I was home. Inside was a trust amendment, filed and notarized roughly 2 weeks after my fall, while I was still in the rehabilitation facility, still on medication strong enough that entire afternoons from that period are hazy to me even now. The amendment named Priyanka directly as a co-beneficiary of the house. Not, in the event of my death. Effective in ways I still don't fully understand, because I am not a lawyer, and no one had ever once sat down and explained any of it to me in language a person without a law degree could actually use. I sat with that document longer than I want to admit before I did anything else. 2 weeks after my fall. Pain medication. A folder Priyanka had brought to my own kitchen table herself, with a lawyer already picked out before I'd even asked a single question. I wanted, badly, for there to be an innocent explanation. So I decided to give my son the chance to provide one. I asked Daniel to come by on his own, without Priyanka, which confused him a little, but he came. I laid the tax notice and my old POA copy on the table between us and asked him, as calmly as I could manage, what he knew about any of it. He didn't deny that changes had been made. What he told me, instead, sitting in the same chair he'd sat in as a boy doing his homework, was that Priyanka had handled all the paperwork side of things, that he had signed wherever she told him to sign, and that he honestly wasn't certain, even now, exactly what all of it said. My son, a grown man with 2 children of his own, had put his signature on documents affecting his mother's house without reading a single page of them. I want to be fair here, because it matters. Daniel did not look, in that moment, like a man executing a plan. He looked like a man who had never once considered that trusting his wife completely might not be the same thing as protecting his mother. That distinction mattered to me even then, even as it also made me furious in a way I didn't yet have words for. What Daniel could tell me about the lawyer, though, gave me my next thread to pull. He remembered her name, Renata Cole, and remembered Priyanka describing her as basically neutral, recommended by a mutual friend, no relation to anyone in the family. It was Marion, of all people, who unraveled that description for me. At a lunch the following week, my sister mentioned offhand that the name Renata Cole sounded familiar, and after a few minutes of turning it over out loud, placed it, a cousin of Priyanka's, on her mother's side, who had married and changed her surname years earlier. Marion's husband found, without much trouble, an old cached version of the law firm's website that still listed Renata Patel as an associate attorney, dated well before any name change would have taken place. The lawyer who had drafted paperwork protecting my interests was my daughter-in-law's cousin. Not neutral. Not a mutual friend's honest recommendation in any meaningful sense. Family, quietly working for family, against the one member of the family who had never been told any of it. I did not confront Priyanka that week. I did not confront Daniel again either, not yet. What I decided instead was that if I was going to fix this, I needed someone in my corner who had never met Priyanka, never met Renata Cole, and had no reason to protect anyone's feelings but my own. Slowly, I remembered the name of the attorney who had handled Frank's estate more than 15 years earlier, Charles Whitfield, an older man even then, who I half assumed would be retired by now. He wasn't. His office was smaller, tucked into a strip mall instead of the downtown building I remembered. But he recognized my name the moment his secretary said it over the phone, and more importantly, he still had my file. My original will was inside it, untouched, exactly as Frank and I had written it. Together, naming Daniel as my sole heir with no conditions and no co-beneficiaries of any kind. Whitfield read through the copies I'd brought him without saying much, sliding his glasses down his nose the way I remembered him doing 15 years earlier over Frank's paperwork. When he finally looked up, he asked me only one question: Eleanor, when you signed this amendment, did anyone from an independent source explain to you, in plain terms, what it actually changed? I told him no, that Priyanka had explained it, and that Priyanka was the one who stood to benefit from it. He nodded slowly. The way a man nods when a suspicion he'd already formed gets confirmed out loud, and told me that was precisely the kind of arrangement courts tended to look at very closely. Whitfield referred me to a younger attorney he trusted, Ms. Reyes, who took the case seriously the moment I laid out the timeline in her small, cluttered office, the folder at my kitchen table, the 1-year power of attorney, the amendment filed 2 weeks later while I was still medicated. The cousin posing as a neutral referral. Ms. Reyes told me plainly, tapping her pen against a legal pad covered in notes, that the strongest piece we were still missing was medical, proof that I had never been formally assessed as lacking capacity at the time I signed anything, because without that, my case would rest on suspicion instead of fact, no matter how the timeline looked on paper. That proof came from my own doctor, Dr. Okafor, who had treated me through the entire recovery and still saw me twice a year. He confirmed, in a short, direct letter, what I already knew but had never thought to ask anyone to formally document, at no point during my hospitalization or the months that followed had I been evaluated for, or diagnosed with, any impairment to my decision-making capacity. I had been in pain. I had been medicated for that pain. I had never been declared incompetent by anyone at any point, because the truth was that no one had ever actually checked. With the capacity letter, the original will, the lapsed and improperly renewed power of attorney, and the clear conflict of interest tied to Renata Cole, Ms. Reyes told me we had more than enough grounds to petition the court to void the trust amendment entirely. She asked whether I wanted to notify my son before we filed, or let the paperwork speak first. I said I wanted to tell him myself. whatever else Daniel had failed to do over the last 2 years, he deserved to hear this from his mother's mouth. Before he heard it in a court document mailed to his house. I asked him to come alone again, on a Thursday evening this time, no dinner, no pretense. I laid everything out across the same kitchen table where Priyanka had first set down her folder 2 years before: the tax notice, my old POA copy, the recorded amendment, the printed archive page showing Renata Patel's old name, and Dr. Okafor's letter, side by side, in order, like a timeline he could read with his own eyes instead of hearing secondhand. His first response was denial. He said I must be misreading things, that Priyanka wouldn't do that to me, that there had to be some explanation none of us had thought of yet. I asked him, then, to explain the 1-year clause himself, or the timing of the amendment 2 weeks after my fall, or the fact that his wife's own cousin had prepared it under a different name. He couldn't answer any of it. His denial cracked, slowly, into something closer to guilt, and for one brief, ugly moment, the guilt curdled into blaming me, asking why I hadn't just come to him directly 2 years ago instead of letting it, in his words, become this whole investigation. I told him, as steadily as I could manage with my hands shaking under the table, that I had trusted my own son enough not to read every document line by line while recovering from surgery, and that trusting him should never have been the mistake in the story. Something in his face gave way when I said that. He admitted, quietly, staring at the letter from Dr. Okafor instead of at me, that he'd had a strange feeling about the renovation talk for months, that Priyanka had started referring to the house differently well before that Sunday dinner, and that he had said nothing, because saying something meant a fight with his wife he didn't want to have. So you knew, I said, and you let me keep thinking it was nothing. I didn't know, Mom. Not like this. I had a feeling, and I let the feeling go because it was easier. I asked him what he thought would have happened if that tax notice had never landed in my mailbox, if I had simply lived out the rest of my life never knowing. He didn't answer that one. He just looked at the papers on the table for a long time, and I let the silence sit there, because I didn't owe him a way out of it. I told him the petition had already been filed with the court. It wasn't a threat, and I didn't say it like one. It was simply true, and I wanted him to hear it from me, at this table, before it arrived as something official in his mailbox. The legal process itself turned out to be far less dramatic than everything that had led up to it. MS. Reyes's filing laid out the timeline so plainly: the lapsed POA, the medicated signing, the undisclosed family relationship with the drafting attorney, the doctor's letter, that Priyanka's own lawyer, a different one entirely once Renata Cole's conflict of interest became impossible to explain away, recommended settling rather than fighting a capacity claim they had no way to disprove. The trust amendment was voided by court order. The county restored my name as sole owner of record, exactly as it had stood for the 29 years before any of this ever began. Priyanka did not take it quietly. Through Daniel, I heard that she felt attacked, that everything she'd done had been meant to protect the family's future, that I was being ungrateful after 2 years of help she insisted I never could have managed without. I don't doubt that some part of her genuinely believes that. It doesn't change what the documents show, or when they were filed, or who prepared them, or under what name she was hiding. Marion told me later that news of the court filing moved through the extended family faster than I expected, the way these things always do. 2 of Priyanka's book club friends stopped inviting her to things for a while, awkwardly, without ever explaining why. My grandchildren, who are old enough to Sensed tension but too young to be told the details. Asked me once why Sunday dinners had stopped for a few months. I told them only that the grown-ups needed some time to sort out a disagreement, which was true enough for a 9-year-old and an 11-year-old to accept without more questions. Daniel did not leave his marriage over any of this, and I never once asked him to. What he did do, a few weeks after the title was restored, was come to the house alone one more time, not to negotiate anything, not to plead Priyanka's case, just to sit at that same kitchen table and tell me that he believed me, that he was ashamed of how easily he'd let his wife make decisions about his mother's home without ever reading a single page himself, and that he didn't yet know how to fix what those 2 years had done to how I saw him. I told him I didn't need him to fix it that afternoon. I needed him to keep showing up honestly from now on, which was already more than he'd managed in 2 years combined. Things between Daniel and me are quieter now, and slower to rebuild than I expected them to be. I don't see Priyanka often, and when I do, we are polite in the specific, careful way people are polite once there's nothing left worth pretending about. I don't say any of this with satisfaction. Justice, in this case, never once felt like winning. It felt like exhaling, finally, after holding my breath for 2 years without fully realizing I'd been holding it at all. The house is still the house I paid off myself, dollar by dollar, over 11 long years. The kitchen is still painted the color I chose, twice, over 31 years, and if it ever gets new cabinets, it will be because I decided that for myself, not because someone announced it to a table full of guests. While I sat there being talked about instead of talked to. A few Sundays ago, I made dinner again, just Daniel and me this time, nothing elaborate, roast chicken. And the same green beans I've made for 30 years. We didn't discuss the trust, or Priyanka, or any of what had happened. We talked about nothing in particular, the way you do over dessert, and for the first time in longer than I want to admit, the quiet at my own table felt like peace instead of a warning I hadn't wanted to hear. I never raised my voice through any of it, not once, not even at the worst of it. I didn't need to. I just needed to stop assuming that the people who loved me would always tell me the truth on their own. And start reading, carefully, for myself, exactly what I was signing my name to.